Angus Young isn't much taller than his guitar. He doesn't give emotional backstage speeches or try to become a symbol. He hasn't changed much in more than 50 years. He still wears the schoolboy uniform and plays the deep red Gibson SG. He still does the immortal duck walk and thrashes across the stage like a kid skipping class to cause trouble. But behind the image of that eternal schoolboy is someone who has never really been okay. Angus Young is afraid of the stage. His hands shake every time he steps into the spotlight. He saw his brother lose his memory and die. He kept playing while a close friend died. He's been wrongly linked to horrible murder cases. This piece doesn't praise the well-known things like Back in Black or Highway to Hell. Instead, it tells the story of the everyday bits and pieces, the unexpected, and even the strange moments that make up the real Angus Young. Quiet, stubborn, deeply emotional, and loyal to the point of being obstinate. When AC/DC stormed into the studio to write and record Back in Black in 1980, Angus Young was only 25 years old. His brother Malcolm was 27, Phil Rudd was 26, Cliff Williams was 30, and Brian Johnson, who had just replaced Bon Scott after his sudden death, was 32. At a time when most musicians were still fumbling around in bar bands, Angus Young was carrying the weight of a falling giant. Bon Scott was his friend, brother, and only voice. AC/DC had just died after a night of heavy drinking in a parked car. The band didn't have time to mourn. They could either break up or make something strong enough to survive the tragedy. They chose the latter, just as a real storm hit. It was hurricane season in the Bahamas, where they had chosen to record at Compass Point Studios. The wind howled through the studio windows, the ceiling leaked, but the riffs kept coming out. "We had pretty much nothing on the first day," Angus remembered. Then a few days later the whole album was there. Back in Black was finished in just 7 weeks. When it came out, it wasn't just a tribute to Bon Scott, it was a statement of survival, a funeral without tears but bursting with electricity. And the most unbelievable part was the man who wrote those immortal riffs. Many people think that Angus Young's image as a grown man headbanging like he was possessed on an electrified stage, not virtuosic technique or stirring speeches to the crowd, was the idea of his sister Margaret Young. In the early days of AC/DC, Angus tried on all sorts of crazy stage costumes, like a superhero, a nurse, and even a gorilla. None of them lasted more than a night until Margaret said, "You always look like a kid playing hooky, why don't you just wear a school uniform on stage?" Angus tried it on, and he hasn't taken it off since. What began as a family joke became his trademark. The man inside shook so badly before every show that he had to trick himself by pretending to be someone else. "When I put that outfit on, I'm no longer Angus, I'm a character, and that character is crazy enough to be on stage." For almost 50 years, Angus hasn't changed his outfit. He doesn't follow trends or update his image. He doesn't need big smoke machines or choreographed performances. Just that uniform, the cherry red SG legs kicked high with voltage and a riff strong enough to bring the whole venue down. For Angus, repetition isn't boring, it's loyalty to himself, his band, and the raw rock and roll he chose to ride with until the very end. In a world where artists change guitars like clothes, one style per tour, a new look for every video, Angus Young has only ever had one, the Gibson SG. It has a thin cherry red body that seems to fuse to him every time he steps on stage. "I don't need 20 guitars, I just need the one that understands my voice," Angus once said. That SG isn't just an instrument, it's a loyal interpreter between his hands and the world. When Angus shaky before a show, that guitar grounds him. When words fail to express what he feels, it sings for him. When Malcolm quit the band, when Bon Scott died, when millions of fans screamed below and all he felt was loneliness under the lights, that guitar was still there. And unlike many other guitarists, Angus never tried to play faster, shred harder, or show off with fancy tricks. He doesn't solo to impress, he solos to steady himself and lock his inner scream into something real that he can control. No one would guess that Angus Young, who runs like a whirlwind on stage and bangs his head like crazy for 2 hours straight, is also someone who trembles every time he performs. But that's exactly who he is. From the first time he stepped on stage with AC/DC, Angus knew he wasn't meant to be in the spotlight. He doesn't like talking to crowds or the media, and he once said, "I'm not good at balancing the outside world and my own world." Because of this, before every show he falls into a familiar state, he feels like he's about to make a mistake that can't be fixed. Those around him see a perfectly timed, blazing Angus. Angus is young, but inside he's struggling to stay upright before the show. He got through it by changing into someone else. Every time he puts on the schoolboy uniform, he changes. He's no longer the man who was afraid of the stage, he becomes the character he created, a misfit school kid who is rebellious, wild, reckless, and fearless. It's that character, not Angus, who roars on stage, darting back and forth with the cherry red SG and playing each riff as if shouting directly into the face of fear. Angus doesn't drink, smoke, or take sedatives to deal with his anxiety. He has one ritual: put on the outfit, tune the guitar, lower his head, and step out. Most of the time I'm so scared I want to run away, but I've learned how to keep it inside and turn it in. Angus Young is different because he doesn't stand on stage to be worshipped, he does it because that's the only place where fear can become music. And maybe those crazy headbangs that everyone thinks are part of the act are just Angus holding himself together. Angus Young has never liked defending himself, especially to people who listen to music just to find something to criticize, and even less to people who say AC/DC is planting violent or satanic messages in the minds of young people. When Highway to Hell came out in the late 1970s, AC/DC became a target of the Satanic Panic, a movement that saw rock music as the devil's tool. They were accused of spreading evil messages, and rumors even went around that if you played their records backwards, you'd. Angus responded with a dry laugh and a message from one of his few public speeches: "Why bother? It's written right on the cover, Highway to Hell. If I made it any clearer I'd have to draw you a map." That's typical Angus Young, blunt, sarcastic, never trying to please anyone, and rock and roll isn't a moral discourse to him, it's raw life force, a natural rebellion that everyone has the right to tap into, no permission needed. And just like he wears the same uniform, plays the same guitar, and shakes the same head, he's also been writing the same lyrics about drinking, women, darkness, and rebellion for decades. He doesn't change them, not because he's glorifying anything bad, but because he believes music is the only place where people can be honest about their darker sides without having to apologize for it. The death of his brother Malcolm Young caused him to fall into an unusually long silence. Malcolm wasn't just a co-founder of AC/DC, he also created the band's sound, rhythm, and spirit. While Angus was the lightning bolt on stage, Malcolm was the rock-solid ground below it. A man who never played a riff out of time, a man who always knew when to say enough, and most importantly, a man Angus could trust completely since they played music together in their Sydney living room. They didn't need many words, they talked to each other through guitars. In 2014, Malcolm was diagnosed with severe dementia. He forgot the chords he had written for the songs that had made AC/DC famous. Angus knew it couldn't be fixed, but he took Malcolm out of the studio, sat him down, and played guitar for a long time. The singer sometimes didn't answer and sometimes just nodded. Almost 3 years later, Malcolm Young died. As usual, Angus didn't give a long speech. He just said, "Mal was the foundation of AC/DC. Without Mal I wouldn't have done anything." But that loss filled every note of Power Up, the album that came out in 2020 after years of AC/DC not being active. Angus called it an album for Malcolm, just like Back in Black was a farewell to Bon Scott. During the recording process, Angus kept an empty guitar set aside in the studio as a place for Malcolm. No one touched it, and no one sat there anymore. To Angus, he and his wife Ellen have lived together quietly for over 40 years in a modest house in the Netherlands. They don't have any children and have never explained why Angus never shows up at entertainment events like film festivals, fashion shows, colleague weddings, or medal ceremonies. He disappears from the outside world when he's not on tour, as if part of him never really belonged to the public, just passing through to perform and then stepping back. He doesn't use social media, take selfies, or post weekly updates about the band like so many modern artists do. All he needs is a quiet place to put down his guitar and a woman who knows he's okay. Someone once asked him, "Are you happy not having children?" And Angus just shrugged and said, "I've got the band, I've got music, I've got Malcolm, I've got Ellen, I don't think I'm missing anything." For Angus Young, being quiet isn't a retreat, it's the reward after a lifetime of screaming for rock and roll. In 2023, a real estate company in Sydney tore down an old, broken-down house in Burwood. It was just a $5.8 million Australian dollar property that needed to be cleared for redevelopment. They didn't know or hadn't been told that this was where George, Malcolm and Angus grew up and where AC/DC started, with the first riffs coming from the living room. That house used to have a commemorative plaque and was a pilgrimage site for fans from all over the world who came to stand in front of it and imagine that this is where Australian rock and roll began. But because of a series of administrative mistakes, the property's historical value was never passed on to its new owners, and it was destroyed by bulldozers one summer morning. When the news came out, Australia was shocked. Thousands of AC/DC fans spoke out in protest. Journalists, historians, and artists all expressed outrage and sadness. Angus Young didn't say anything. He stayed silent as usual. Maybe that house belonged to the past for him, but to everyone who grew up listening to his guitar, it was an indelible part of their memories. The unintended destruction felt like a piece of rock and roll's soul had been found and broken in the middle of an uninterested city. Sometimes, legacy doesn't go away in a loud explosion, it goes away in silence, and Angus Young may be the only one who hears it. Malcolm Young asked his younger brother Angus, who was only 18, to start a band called C/DC, which stands for alternating current. Neither of them knew they were starting one of the longest, craziest, and most uncompromising journeys in rock history. Angus got into music instinctively, with no formal training or plan. He brought with him a Gibson SG, a school uniform, and an energy that he couldn't explain. Other artists of the time were trying to find their style. Angus chose nothing. AC/DC began as a real bar band playing in the middle of beer slurping, screaming, and flying bottles. It was in that chaos that Angus created his famous stage style, the frantic duck walk, headbanging, knees bouncing to each riff like a controlled seizure of sound. When AC/DC released High Voltage in 1975 and Let There Be Rock in 1977, Angus stood out as a livewire presence on stage, but behind the chaos was a highly organized mind. He and Malcolm oversaw every riff structure, rhythm, and song progression. Angus wasn't just the performing face, he was the musical backbone. When Bon Scott died in 1980, everything seemed like it was about to fall apart, but Angus went beyond the role of the energetic younger brother and became the band's main creative force with Back in Black, which he co-wrote with Bon, is not only a farewell to Bon but also a musical peak that will never be matched. The opening riff of Back in Black is a living legacy. It can be heard in stadiums, festivals, weddings, funerals, battles, and movies, and the man who wrote it was only 25 years old. From the 1980s to the 2000s, musical trends changed all the time, but Angus Young stayed the same and played the same guitar, playing riffs that seemed old but always gave the new generation goosebumps. AC/DC released Razor's Edge, Ballbreaker, Stiff Upper Lip, and even Power Up, an album dedicated to Malcolm, the oldest brother who died of dementia. During the journey, AC/DC had lineup changes, scandals, critical dismissals, and huge comebacks, but Angus never changed. He didn't do it to stay relevant, to please the audience, or to hide the fact that he was getting older. You don't have to change to survive, you just have to be yourself for long enough. Angus Young never tried to become famous. He just kept playing the same way, wore the same clothes, and let out the same inner scream for 50 years. Even as the world, technology, and even his own band changed, Angus held on to that original rhythm. He never sped up, drifted away, or lost it. He never talked about loneliness, but you could see it in the way he bowed his head before the amplifier at every show. He never cried on stage, but you could hear the pain in the pounding opening riff of Thunderstruck. He never made grand statements, sought shiny awards, or told his life story on talk shows. But he stood there every time AC/DC almost fell apart, through the funerals of friends, and then he went back out in the same old clothes and wore the same old SG. There were no words needed, just one note. For rock and roll, Angus Young isn't the leader, he's the river that never stops.